I drilled it dead center and it got so thin that it came out in a few little thread rings like this. Hey, it's Brock here with Rock Hill Farm, and I've got a couple of broken bolts that I need to drill out today. And I decided that while I'm removing these two bolts, I'm going to make the most comprehensive video that I can about how to remove broken bolts. Now, unlike a lot of the things I do on this channel, I actually have a ton of experience with removing broken bolts. When I worked in a factory setting repairing machines, I would say on average I had at least one broken bolt per week that I had to remove. And I worked there for 13 years. So that's hundreds, if not thousands, of broken bolts. And I've removed them with a lot of different methods. So today, as we go through actually removing the two bolts that I need to get out today, I'm going to tell you everything I know about the topic. So I guess we ought to get started and I'll show you the bolts we're dealing with. They're broke off basically flush, slightly below the level, and they are small diameter bolts. I believe those are an 8mm. My regulars, I'll go ahead and tell you what's going on here. I'm doing like a week-long project redoing the interior of this Jeep. We've got actually a lot of different things we're doing to it. I think it's going to be really cool, but it won't publish until everything's done. And all of these bolts were really rusty and really hard to get out, and we soaked them, and finally, out of everything, two of the last bolts we had to take out broke on the same component. Anyway, enough storytelling. Let's talk about broken bolts. There are a lot of different types of broken bolts, different situations, different scenarios, your ability to access it, the diameter of the bolt, the grade of the bolt. All of these change how you're going to deal with it. But let's try to talk universally a little bit. The first thing I'm going to do with any broken bolt is clean the hole out where I can see it. Now, if it's sticking up, it's a different matter, but assuming it's recessed down in a hole, first thing I'm going to do is spray it with penetrating fluid, and then after that's soaked in, as long as I'm going to let it at least 30 minutes, I'm going to spray that out with an air hose so that it's now clean and I can see down in the hole to see the condition of the bolt. The next thing I'm going to do, especially if it's a larger diameter bolt, is try to remove it with a punch. And actually, let me grab a punch and show you what I'm talking about. In my experience, in the factory setting, it was very common to have a bolt break, and for me to be able to remove it with one of these punches. I'm going to step out of the way and see if it'll zoom in and focus on the punch. This is a small diameter, it's hardened steel. These were used as knives to cut wire, and once they were no longer usable, we sharpened them and used them as punches. So basically you would just pick a spot towards the outside like this, or for demonstration purposes, this, drive it in, and then angle back and drive it around. Now, I mentioned that I don't think these bolts are a good candidate for that type of removal. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, they're a small diameter, but I've removed small diameter bolts with punches. I've also removed 1-inch diameter bolts that were broke off in the side of a machine and removed those with punches. It depends on other factors. Now, often in the environment I was in, the bolts had not been in there that long. They were new bolts put in, and pounding force or the vibration of the machine caused that bolt to break prematurely. In this scenario, these bolts are really old, and the reason they broke is they were rusted too hard. So we were taking these out, we sprayed them with a penetrating oil and got them to break loose. Sprayed them again, worked them out a little ways, sprayed them again, and then taking them out, snapped them off. So those bolts are in there incredibly tight. So whatever removal method has to be able to put a tremendous amount of force on it. The tapping method is usually more likely to work if you had a bolt break from pressure under use. And in that scenario, it's going to be tight because it was being pulled on the threads, but it's not going to be nearly as tight as something that's been rusted up for 25 years. Now, before we actually start removing these bolts, there's one more strategy that can work for bolts like I was just talking about when they're further down in the hole. So if you have like a 4-inch bolt that breaks off 1.5 inches or 2 inches down in the hole, you can't get a punch down in there 2 inches deep in a 3/8 diameter hole. So another thing you can try is a left-handed drill bit. This is a cheap set from Harbor Freight, but I've removed a lot of bolts with left-handed drill bits. So they look like regular drill bits, but the flutes go the other way, and the cutting tip on the top goes the other way. And the theory there is pretty obvious. You spin it backward, and it drills a hole in the bolt. And as it spins, sure, most of you guys have had a drill bit that kind of catches and then tries to rip your arm off. If that happens and you hold the drill still, it's putting that torque onto the bolt. So you can drill a small hole right-handed and then slightly bigger left-handed, and it's going to bite, and it might spin it out. If it doesn't spin it out, then you have a hole drilled in your bolt, which is what we need anyway for extraction. So sometimes this $7 drill bit kit will remove your bolt for you. The next thing before we get into the type of bolts we're dealing with today is if your bolt breaks off but there's a stud exposed. Most people are going to immediately grab a pair of vice grips, and that can work. A lot of times it does work. But if that bolt was seized up or rusted in there really hard, this may not remove the bolt, and it will prevent you from using some other methods. So I would not go to the vice grips first. If you have a lot of studs sticking up and it still has threads on it, my first thing that I would do is run 2 nuts down on it, jam those 2 nuts onto each other, and then run it up by turning the bottom one. And you can do that if you don't damage the threads first with vice grips. Another option there is if you can put a nut on it but you don't have room for 2 nuts, you can run 1 nut down, weld the nut onto the stud, and now it's just like having a bolt head again. And that's going to work a lot of the time. Now, if you can't get nuts to run down, or you don't have access to a welder or something like that, probably your next bet is vice grips. If the vice grips don't work, you can use stud extractors. The way these work, they're slightly bigger than the bolt size. They're sized, this one works on certain diameters of bolts. You drive this on, and it bites in harder than a set of vice grips, and it cuts into the threads of the bolt. And then you put a socket or a wrench on this and turn it out. So there are 4 options for a broken stud that's sticking up. The option to weld a nut onto the bolt is one that I could use here because these are just barely recessed. So that would work in this scenario, but it's not going to be the first thing I go to. So what we're going to do today is the most typical method that all of you are familiar with, but I want to cover it with some nuance. And that is drilling a hole, putting in a screw extractor or an easy out, and then backing it out with that. This is an example of a easy out set or a bolt extractor set. It comes with the extractor, and next to it is the drill bit that you should use with that extractor. And I actually mentioned this in my tool review video that I won't even use these unless I don't have a choice or it's not a important high leverage situation. This is a really cheap set. I'm afraid of breaking them, especially the smaller sizes. But these have a twisted flute, and the edges of this are sharp enough that when you tap it in and then turn it counterclockwise for removal, it bites in. The nice thing about these is if you've got this in the hole and you're not able to get enough torque and it won't come out, just turn it one flat the opposite way, it pops right out. So putting this into your drilled hole does not lock you into that method. Bolt extractors come in a lot of different shapes and styles. This is the type of extractor that I have a lot of experience with. And they work even down in a deep hole. One thing I'll note about when you're drilling into a deep hole, it's absolutely critical that any hole you drill gets centered. If you get off into the threads of the hole, you have a problem. So it's important that you're centered. One tip, if you're drilling a deep hole that has any size to it, is to make yourself a little homemade guide. So if I've got a hole that is this deep before I hit the bolt that needs removed, there are instances, it won't always work, it depends on the diameter of the bolt and those types of things, where you can put a deep well socket down into the hole and then run your drill bit through that socket, and that will prevent you from getting off-centered and drilling into the threads inside the hole. And this can be a real lifesaver if it's down in there. You can get bolt extractors similar to the ones I just had that are more square instead of the fluted design. Those work the same way, but they don't allow you to pop them out as easily, so I don't like those quite as well. Another option is these little stubby, socket-driven extractors that use the same principle. They go into the hole and pop out the same way. They have the same type of flutes on them, but they're made where you can put a wrench or a socket on them, which gives you a lot more leverage. If your stud or your bolt is not broke off deep in the hole, these give you more torque. You can drive them in deeper, and they're better, but they're short. So you can't use it if your bolt is really buried down in the hole. Now with these bolts, I see two good options right off the top of my head. The first is what we've already talked about, to weld a nut onto those broken bolts, then just turn the nut out. We may resort to that, but I'm not going to start there. So once I've decided that I want to use a bolt extractor, I need to know what size extractor and what size drill bit. If you do a Google search for screw extractor drill bit reference chart or something like that, you'll find a chart that says this diameter bolt should use this drill bit and this extractor. And that's a very good starting point. So I've done that. I've brought up a chart. These are an M8 or 8mm bolt. I should be using an 1/8 or 9/64 drill bit. And it gave me on that chart a reference to the type of the size of traditional screw extractor. But because I'm going to use these, I've looked at these, and the smallest one says use with 1/8 inch drill. So since I can use an 1/8 inch drill bit on this size, we're going to start with this smallest one. If it feels like I'm being really slow and deliberate getting through this message, I think that's a good reflection of how you need to treat the bolt removal. You don't want to just say, oh, that broke, and just grab a drill and start going. You got to be thoughtful about what you're doing. So we've made the decision we're going to drill that out with an 1/8 inch drill bit. Now we get a center punch the same size as the bolt, and we're going to center this up on the bolt head and make a strong indentation right in the center. I've used this method on grade 5 and grade 8 bolts a lot, and even on the harder grade 8 bolts, I'm accustomed to that punch making a significant divot in the bolt head, and I'm not seeing that happen. So I'm going to say this is definitely a hardened bolt, and it may give us problems trying to drill it. But really, there's a lot of things that can give you problems trying to drill. One is the way the bolt breaks off. Sometimes these bolts will break off where it's like a mountain. It's high in the middle. And obviously, if it's pointed where it breaks off, your drill bit's just going to want to walk down that point. That's where I mentioned that one trick earlier. Another idea for dealing with that is if it's exposed, if you can get a grinder or even a miniature grinding wheel down in there and flatten that off, that definitely helps. So I'm going to go ahead and start drilling and see how we do. I drill a very small amount, and then I stop and make sure my hole's centered. If I'm even just a tiny bit off center, you can still fix that if you do it before you get very deep. And so if you start just a little bit off to the left, move over to this side, angle it before you get any depth, and you can scoot that divot over by drilling at an angle and then stand it back up and finish drilling. So this is really struggling. I think the bolt's harder than my drill bit, but I'm still not getting in a hurry. I'm making sure that I'm drilling perfectly centered, and we're pretty darn close to perfectly centered. I need to be using some cutting fluid, but I don't want to yet. I want to make sure that my hole is where I need it and that I'm a little deeper, and then I'll start with the cutting fluid. One thing I've learned over time with these is you don't have to hammer them into the hole you've drilled. Basically, the twisting motion forces it down and bites it, and if you're trying to tighten or loosen the bolt, remove the bolt, it's not going to come loose on you. You do not have to hammer this in. Now, another thing that's a big deal about this is it's a really small diameter on the part that actually is down in the hole. You can easily snap this off. So I don't think I hit record on it, so I think I missed the clip, but I just tapped this in and tried to turn it. And I would almost use a 1/4-inch drive instead of a 3/8 for like a torque limiter. But I put my hand up here and I put just a reasonable amount of pressure and it didn't immediately come loose, which isn't surprising. This bolt was tight enough that it snapped off the first time. So you don't necessarily want to put a lot of torque on it right now. We're going to soak it with penetrating oil again, then we're going to try some heat. As you're watching, keep in mind that our purpose of this whole project is to remove all the paint off this, so that's not a negative. So we just got the worst possible result that we could get, which is breaking an easy out off in the hole. Because now you can't really drill the easy out. There's nothing you can do about it as far as that style of extraction. And you might think, well, that's embarrassing. And as someone who's a YouTuber, and in this case, which I don't do very often, I'm trying to put out a how-to video. So why would you show yourself making the worst mistake that you can make? Well, I'm not embarrassed by it because this sometimes happens. And I've seen guys with a lot of experience and, machining backgrounds break off easy outs. The other thing that I said in the beginning is, I think the key to this, or one of them, is only use high-quality bolt extractors. The smaller sizes are the ones that are going to try to break off on you. They're very hard, and they have to be hard to dig in and bite hard enough to pull it out. Hard materials are brittle. Small hard materials are very brittle. And I mentioned it earlier, I should have used a 1/4-inch drive instead of the 3/8 to limit my torque. But what's done is done. So at this point, I'm lucky in that this isn't the most critical thing. It's not an engine block. So I still have some options. The only thing I'm embarrassed about on this is that I should have been smart enough to grind the paint off before heating that up so I wasn't putting paint fumes off into the air. What I'm going to attempt now is to weld this washer to the bolt, then weld a nut on top of that, and then use the nut to turn it out. So everything I've tried hasn't worked. But that doesn't mean that we stop. I've got some ideas for the one that we've already messed up. But before I do that, I'm going to try a larger screw extractor, bolt extractor. The small ones just break easy. And the more you go up, the more torque you can put on it. So we're going to try this one. We have a larger diameter extractor and a 1/4-inch drive wrench like I should have started with. Less likely to break it off, but that doesn't mean the bolt comes out. All right, I think they're probably not as good, but I'm not getting a result with that, so I'm going to try one of these traditional types. I was able to get this large extractor down in that hole and then torque on it with a 1/2-inch drive ratchet. I'm able to put a ton of torque on it like that, and it did not matter. So there's not enough wall left on this bolt. I've drilled 90% of it out, so I think that extractor's pushing out too hard. There's no way it's going to come out. I think I'm going to try to drill out the entire bolt because I'm drilled perfectly dead center. And so I'm going to see if I can drill the whole thing out and then run a tap through it. There she goes. We're popping pieces out. I'm able to put a bolt in it. I got that so thin and so perfectly centered, I was able to spin it down through the hole. And I will run a tap through that, although I don't have a tap this size. I'm going to have to go get some more taps to finish it off. So one of the 2 holes is done. One left to go. This is what I got down to. I drilled it dead center, and it got so thin that it came out in a few little thread rings like this. We're going to drill this all the way through like I did the other one. So I had some problems. Most of the time removing broken bolts, there are some problems. I made a couple of mistakes, but they weren't the type of mistakes that I couldn't recover from. The trick of welding a nut onto a stud, I have seen someone do that, but I never tried it myself. And I'm a very, very much a novice welder, and I didn't even get a good weld on it. That's one of the problems there. And then that made it harder to locate the hole afterwards. So the plate that seat bracket threads into is probably a 1/4 inch thick. And now one of those two holes will only have about 1/8 of an inch of threads after I run the tap through it. Because finding that hole, I kind of messed it up a little bit. But the bolts are out and I can move on to the next project. And if you guys are interested in the Jeep rebuild, it's going to be awesome. We've got some really cool upgrades we're making. I just got a package in the mail right before I came back out to the shop, and pretty excited about it. We're going to hopefully have this all done, and it's going to look like a new Jeep in a couple days. I appreciate you taking time to watch the video. I'll put links on the screen to a couple more of our videos, and I'll see you next time.